Hey guys, J. Stephen Roberts here, and we're going to continue with our discussion of the Northern Crusades. So, in our last podcast, I think we did a pretty good overview of the Teutonic Knights, an introduction to them. Today, we're going to look at two more military orders that got involved in the Northern Crusades, the Sword Brothers and the Knights of the Bishop of Prussia. The Sword Brothers are really quite interesting. They were absolutely ruthless, and their story is pretty intense, so I'm looking forward to talking about that. They were highly involved in the Livonian Crusade, which we're going to be talking about quite a bit in the next couple of podcasts. So, as we get into the 13th century, two smaller orders got involved in the push against the East Baltic pagans. These are the Sword Brothers and the Knights of the Bishop of Prussia, also known as the Knights of Dobrin. So the story of the Sword Brothers begins in around 1202, when Albert, the Bishop of Riga, who was a Saxon by birth, was trying to convert the pagan Livs to Christianity, and he was not having much success. This outpost at Riga, which is at the mouth of the Vina River, was frequently being raided by the local pagans, and the Livs were not taking baptism very seriously. Now, just to give us some perspective, Riga is the modern-day capital of Latvia. And Albert, the bishop, was wanting to push farther into the Vina River Valley, but he was not able to do this. Crusades that were called occasionally seemed to, achieve certain conquests, but then they would be pushed back by the Livs. So the question was how to be more successful at this. And Albert decided he needed an army. And so what he did was he recruited a small group of knights to make their crusading vow into a religious profession, much like the Knights Templar. I'm sure he was thinking of something like this when he organized them. What this group of knights would do would be that they would hold down the fortress at Riga as a permanent garrison. Meanwhile, Albert could go back to Christendom and recruit more crusaders for the regular campaigns. At the same time, the local priests could preach to the Livs while being protected by the Sword Brothers. So we can see here what Albert was thinking. The idea was that there would be regular crusades that would arrive to the Vina River Valley, and these would help secure wider control of the area. At the same time, once those crusaders went home, the Sword Brothers would act as a garrison to hold on to that territory through the difficult winter months until another campaign could be organized. The Sword Brothers dressed something like the Knights Templar. They wore white mantles with an emblem on their shoulders, which was a red sword and a small cross. Now, let's go on to the Knights of the Bishop of Prussia. So, 5 years later, in 1206, a Bishop Christian, who was in fact a Pomeranian by birth. Now, if you'll remember, the Pomeranians were one of those initially pagan groups that were conquered during the era of the Wendish Crusade. So, we kind of see how this goes. The conquered become part of the conquerors later on. So, Bishop Christian was trying to convert and pacify the Prussians on the lower Vistula, and he was having even more trouble than Bishop Albert was initially. Now, Bishop Christian had the aid of the King of Denmark and also had some Polish nobility who were helping him, but still his position was very much vulnerable to the harassing Prussian raids. The Prussians would come out from the interior and devastate his holdings. And so he, like Bishop Albert, realized he needed some sort of permanent garrison of heavily armed knights who would be able to kind of hold down the fort during the times when there weren't active crusade campaigns in the area. So what he did was he recruited 14 North German knights and had them swear to vows that were similar to those of the Sword Brothers and gave them a fortress at Dobrin on the Vistula. So this is where they get their other name, the Knights of Dobrin. Their emblem was also similar to that of the Sword Brothers, a sword surrounded by a star. Now, as you guys may have noticed, The Sword Brothers and the Knights of Dobrin were quite different from the initial big three military orders, the Templars, Hospitallers, and Teutonic Knights. For one thing, they were not autonomous organizations. They were, in fact, directly in service to their respective bishops. So the Sword Brothers to Bishop Albert, and the Knights of Dobrin to Bishop Christian. They also had no international lands or patrons. So remember last time we talked about the Teutonic Knights, how they had all these sponsors throughout Christendom. They had estates throughout Christendom. Even more so the Templars and Hospitallers, who were highly wealthy, some of the wealthiest institutions in Christendom at the time. These little orders here on the very edges of the northern frontier of Christendom, they were very small, and they did not have extensive lands all throughout Christendom. They didn't have patrons all over the places. All they had were their little strips of land there on the marches of this frontier on the eastern Baltic. And finally, they had no presence whatsoever in the Holy Land. They were not involved in the campaigns against the Muslims in the Holy Land or in Spain, which all three of the big orders were involved in. These were entirely creatures of the Northern Crusades, and they had quite a different approach to their counterparts in the Holy Land and Spain. So in this initial phase, the beginning of the Livonian Crusade and this push into the Eastern Baltic through the efforts of the Sword Brothers and the Knights of the Bishop of Prussia, Pope Innocent III and Pope Honorius III were quite supportive of both orders. They didn't have much direct involvement at all in their affairs, but they nevertheless endorsed the idea of expanding Christendom into the Dvina and Vistula regions. They even helped organize a few regular crusades in this early period to help bolster the efforts. Now, later on, these orders were going to come into considerable conflict with the papacy, as we will discover in our next podcast. But so, again, as I said earlier, the sporadic crusades that were initially called to these regions just really could not achieve that much on their own. Because what would happen is, some armies would come in, Danes, Saxons, Poles. They would win some, efforts against the Livonians, the local pagan groups. And then once they would leave, the pagans would be able to push back and devastate the holdings of the bishops. And so what was really needed were permanent garrisons, which would occupy these lonely forts in these very remote regions winter after winter. Now, these lands were incredibly sparse, cold, and harsh, and they really weren't attractive to adventurers just seeking pure plunder. They were more well-suited to the hardship demanded of the life of a monk. And so really, this idea of fighting monks here in the north, it really was well-suited to this whole thing. And in fact, Bishop Christian was himself a Cistercian, so he understood the monastic aesthetic. Now, these warrior monks of the Baltic faced two new issues that the Templars and the Hospitallers had really not faced in the Holy Land. And in Eric Christensen's excellent book, The Northern Crusades, he provides some really good comments on this. And I want to go ahead and just read a brief passage from his book. The armed monk of the Baltic had to deal with two classes of people that presented him with problems not solved by the rule of the Templars: the heathen, or non-Muslim infidel, and the convert, or neophyte. The heathen was not in possession of land or shrines that could be viewed as rightfully Christian, like Palestine and the holy places, and he was not necessarily at war with Christendom. Could he be left in peace, or must he always be attacked? Ought a Christian warrior to make truces or alliances with him? Was it sinful to accept conditional surrender, or to grant peace on terms? Was the convert to be made use of and governed, or given complete freedom? Was he the responsibility of the monks who had conquered him, or the priests who had baptized him? Could their claims be reconciled? These questions were not merely academic, because both priests and monks were agents of ecclesiastical authority. And for the 13th century clerics, authority came from doctrine, and doctrine had to be orthodox. So there you go, guys. I think that's a good little introduction to the Sword Brothers and to the Knights of Dobrin. We're going to get more into the function of these warrior monks of the Baltic and how they operated in the next podcast. I'd like to say thanks to my latest Patreon supporters, Vatican Templar, Richard Tung, and Rados Mixa, all of whom pledged $5 monthly. Thanks so much, guys. I really appreciate the support. And if you like what we do, you can support Real Crusades History on Patreon. There is a link below. We do provide rewards to our Patreon supporters.